Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything. Welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen Schmucker, and we are journeying through the New Testament one chapter at a time, and we are in Romans 11 today. Take a moment to think about the best mystery novel you have ever read. You stayed up hours past your bedtime just to turn those final few pages. You were left astounded by the big reveal at the end, and suddenly, you become a big fan of the author, determined to read every other novel written by him. You are enamored. In Romans chapter 11, Paul invites us to become enamored with the author of creation himself, the God who wrote the story of redemption, who delivered his son to die for sinners, but not only to die for them, to deliver them into belonging into the family of God. The author who writes the most beautiful story about himself and his pursuing love of those he created. Today, Paul explores the grace of God as he wraps up these 3 chapters in which he discusses Israel's rejection of Jesus. From chapters 9 and 10, we know that Israel's rejection of God was not due to God's lack of grace. God has continually held his hands out to disobedient and defiant people. Yet over and over again, God's chosen nation rejected him, even when he left the comfort of heaven to dwell near. God's people rejected his ultimate provision for them, Jesus. Ultimately, those from God's own nation crucified his only son. We know from chapter 10 that Paul still desires his people to come to faith. And in chapter 11, Paul shares that no one is too far gone to be saved. Throughout Romans, we have seen Paul anticipate questions of his audience and answer them. Paul anticipates this question in regards to Israel's hardness of heart. Has God rejected his people? To this, Paul answers, absolutely not. God has pursued his people in faithful love all throughout history, and Paul argues that God won't stop now. This is evidence of God's grace, existing in the early days of Israel's history, culminating in the person of Jesus, and continuing in the message of salvation to both Jew and Gentile. God's faithful love remains the same. Paul uses 2 examples of proof that God has not entirely rejected Israel, himself and Elijah. Jesus met Paul on the Damascus road and changed his life. Paul did nothing to deserve meeting Jesus. In fact, he was persecuting Christians. But by grace, Jesus met Paul and extended salvation to him. From Paul's perspective, if Jesus could save him, no one was too far gone. Next, he cites the prophet Elijah. In 1 Kings 19, the prophet Elijah flees from the evil king Ahab and his queen Jezebel, who threatens his life. God meets Elijah in despair upon Mount Sinai. Elijah feels like he is the only Israelite left who is faithful to God, but God assures him that there are in fact many more that he cannot see. So too in Paul's day, God in his grace has preserved a faithful remnant. And by grace, God preserved Paul. Paul remains confident that by God's grace, he will preserve his chosen people. In fact, grace is an enduring theme throughout Romans 11. By God's grace, he allowed Israel's heart to be hardened to graft the Gentiles into God's covenant family. The blessing reserved for Israel was then shared to the Gentiles, so that they may become jealous and turn back to God. Paul uses a metaphor of an olive tree to illustrate his point. Gentiles are like wild olive branches grafted into the root of God's grace. The Jews were once connected to the root, but they fell away, only to make room for Gentile believers. But just in case the Gentiles in the Roman church find themselves feeling arrogant in their blessing, Paul reminds them that they are chosen as God's people purely because of grace. Israel's rejection of Jesus brought reconciliation to the world. He is the holy branch, the true vine, who gives life to his branches. The Gentiles stand in grace by faith, not because of their works. If Israel, God's chosen nation, is broken off in unbelief, Paul calls them to tremble before the Lord. If God did not spare the natural branches, the Israelites, he will not spare unbelieving Gentiles. God's grace is not a gift meant to collect dust on a shelf. It is meant to lead us to worship, to awe, and to deeper faith. God's grace teaches us about himself. He is both kind and just. He cuts off those who persist in unbelief, but welcomes sinners who believe in faith. Paul proclaims that all of Israel will be saved according to the grace and faithfulness of God to keep his promises. But what does Paul mean by all of Israel? Scholars have long debated this. Some believe that before Jesus' second coming, there will be a mass conversion of Jews to faith in Christ, while others believe that all of Israel refers to the spiritual Israel of all those who confess Jesus as Lord. Still others believe Paul is referring to all the Jews throughout history that God has elected and preserved for himself. No matter what you believe about these verses, Paul is proclaiming that Gentile Christians are grafted in because of the Jews' rejection, and future Jews will come to faith out of envy of the Gentiles. God's grace in saving both Jew and Gentile can unite the church rather than sow division. Both Jew and Gentiles are saved by the merciful faithfulness of God. The same God faithful to his people throughout the Old Testament is the same God faithful to both Jew and Gentile now. Today, Paul concludes this section about Israel's rejection of Christ. But what I love is that Paul is hopeful. He steps back and beholds the mystery of God. What was previously unknown to God's people is now understood in Jesus. Jesus is the big reveal, and Paul's reflection leads him to worship. He says, "Oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable his judgments, and his paths beyond tracing out! No man could write such a story." As Paul writes in 1 Timothy 3:16, Jesus is God manifested in the flesh, vindicated in the Spirit, seen by angels, preached among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up into glory. There is no salvation apart from Christ. We behold Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who we come back to again and again, who saved us not by anything we could do of our own accord, but by grace. May he not collect dust on the bookshelf of our heart, but may we come to him for truth, for encouragement, for guidance, and for peace. May we not take God's grace for granted. May we be enamored with Jesus, he who wrote a beautiful story of redemption and invites us to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.